White supremacy has driven the polycrisis. This is a reality that has been well understood for some time in certain circles and by certain thinkers. But because of what that message implicates, it's rarely discussed in fora such as this. In the late 15th century, European powers started a process of extracting the world's wealth, colonisation. As highlighted locally in the work of Tina Ngata, this process was enabled through the international legal concept, the Doctrine of Discovery, born out of a number of Catholic laws. The Catholic Church at the time was something of a supranational sovereign whose pronouncements carried the force of international law, back when international law held real and ultimate authority. The doctrine comprised a range of laws that informed the perceived legitimacy of colonisation. These laws considered unbaptised man homo animales, not a full human, not bearing rights. They identified land occupied by non-Christians as terra nullius, nobody's land, not because the land was empty, but because those who occupied it were not considered people. The Doctrine of Discovery accorded rights to European monarchs to attack, conquer, and subjugate those non-Christians who they considered not capable of rights of autonomy, ownership, authority, and to appropriate their lands, possessions, and goods. These laws were built on well-established ideology that had already been embedded for 1,000 years within European society, such as the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being depicts the world as a hierarchy: God at the top, the Pope below, the monarchs, aristocrats, commoners, and two-legged animals and indigenous peoples, sometimes indigenous peoples being located with demons right at the bottom. As described by the 4th century theologian St. Augustine, if all things were equal, all things could not exist. This underscored the idea that inequality was necessary and in fact divinely ordained. Philosopher Bell Hooks' description of a dominator culture explains how this logic that justifies the domination of nature is the same logic that justifies the domination of people. Sociologist William Dubois observed that white people didn't produce colonisation, the idea of whiteness emerged from colonisation. Similarly, George Lipschitz described whiteness as a fictive identity through which one sought unfair gains and unearned rewards. It's a global story, and so how is it relevant here? The Doctrine of Discovery has also been applied in Aotearoa to sanction and legitimise the theft of land for the purpose of private gain at the cost of the resident Indigenous peoples. This is Te Kākākura, my great-great-great-grandfather. Known as Wee Parata, he took the Bishop of Wellington to the Supreme Court in 1877. Our iwi Ngāti Toa had given land to the Anglican Church at Whitireia in Porirua for the purpose of a school to be built. The church did not build the school and instead obtained a Crown grant giving title of the land to the church. In his decision, Chief Judge Prendergast used US cases that explicitly reference the Doctrine of Discovery to establish a precedent for his decision, which gave the Crown as the colonising state the right to acquire lands from natives. He invoked the Great Chain of Being in his judgment, describing Māori as primitive barbarians. Ngāti Toa were deemed incapable of having property rights in relation to their land in the first place, and Māori incapable of having a right such as sovereignty, let alone ceding it. This was the infamous judgment that rendered Te Tiriti o Waitangi a simple nullity. It determined that Māori were not capable of entering into a political agreement like a treaty. Te Kākākura's legal challenge was dismissed, the land of Ngāti Toa was sacrificed for the purpose of private gain, and the Doctrine of Discovery was operationalised in New Zealand law. Prendergast's understanding at the time was not a unique one. What was unique about this case was Parata, our tupuna, was the son of a Te Aotearoa and Ngāti Toa chieftainess and a British whaler, and in the years before the case, a member of Parliament. This gave him a level of privilege that enabled him to challenge the Crown and elicit a judgment that explicitly laid bare what was the prevailing ideology at the time. This understanding would then continue unchallenged in the courts for the next 126 years, until the 2003 foreshore and seabed legal decision, which overturned the idea that Māori had not been capable of owning property until the Crown introduction of land title. Of course, the Crown's response to this was to overturn the court's decision on the doctrine of discovery and to draft the Foreshore and Seabed Act, which reinforced the doctrine and simply vested ownership of the foreshore and seabed with the Crown where it remains. The doctrine was used to take land from Māori and, importantly, to remove it from their authority and protection and expose it to an extractive agenda that pervades today. This, in fact, is a pattern. The doctrine ideology is operationalised to deny Māori capability of having rights to the environment, and this enables the environment to be exploited for the purpose of private gain. This has been the case with fisheries and forests, and the refusal of the Crown to recognise Māori rights and interest to water. Through institutions such as the Waitangi Tribunal, we have decades of evidence as to the degradation and overuse of these domains and the disproportionate effect of this on Māori communities, our economies, and our way of life. This continues today without great rebuke from the mainstream. This is the sacrifice that is necessary for the unfair gains and unearned rewards that Lipschitz spoke about. You can use and take to an extent that creates harm, unethical harm, if you're able to outsource the harm to particular spaces and to particular communities which are not deemed worthy of protection. From this perspective, we start to understand that the polycrisis is experienced as harm by some, but as immensely rewarding and beneficial to others, particularly in nations such as ours. So where can we see clearly in this day and age that particularly Māori values and Māori spaces are sacrificed for the purpose of private gain? Is the great chain of being still at work in the machine of the coloniser? I now want to take you to the burial ground of my tupuna's mother at Waikanae Beach. This cemetery has been targeted for development since the 1960s, when it was alienated from the original owners through typically dishonest means and into the hands of a developer. By the 1970s, half of this cemetery was excavated for the purpose of a housing development. Eyewitness accounts speak of earth visibly containing kōiwi or human remains being put into a dredge which was ground up and then sprayed back onto the land. When the developer came back in 1999 to recommence developing the other half, a Māori worker on site notified the authorities when 11 individuals' graves were opened up by excavations. The developer was ordered to stop and seek necessary approvals, which they have been pursuing since. Just 3 weeks ago, our people sat through a hearing not just on whether the developer should be able to excavate our people's burial ground, but true to form, the key argument was whether there were any graves there at all. The horror of being an Indigenous person in Aotearoa in 2026 is that photographs of your ancestors' coffins busted open to expose their skeletal remains is still not evidence enough of our rights, of our humanity, or of our existence on the land at all. Waikanae Beach and its $1 million houses is still terra nullius. White supremacy is so ingrained in our legal framework that it is a moot point if our humanity as Māori is worth more than private gain. And that is because the truth is that extraction and accumulation of wealth relies upon the ability to disregard and dehumanise another group. The inevitable effects must be borne somewhere by someone. St. Augustine essentially said it himself: if you want to live like kings, you must have demons, lest we just have to accept our equal share. This dynamic is reaching its climax as the polycrisis deepens. The impact of water degradation, biodiversity loss, climate-induced weather events, they're all evident, but the impact is disproportionately felt by Māori communities. These impacts are the sacrifice that New Zealand society is prepared to make in the interest of maintaining the status quo and all the benefits some of us enjoy from it. Hop Hopkins, a social movement scholar in the US, said it best when he said, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." There is no addressing the polycrisis without addressing the white supremacist culture that drives and ethically enables it. And we know that the endpoint of white supremacy is not just the subjugation of Indigenous people or people of colour or queer people or any other minority. It is the subjugation of humanity itself. As long as there is an appetite for private gain, there is a case to sacrifice the values or the people that are perceived as a lower order of being. White supremacy is, at its heart, simply the need to other for the purpose of securing and maintaining power and wealth for oneself. The polycrisis is the anticipated symptom of a very sick global society. It's been over 60 years since Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring and global environmentalism becoming a mass political movement. But the Silent Spring has been the hundreds of years of resistance, critique and challenge from Indigenous peoples against the hegemony of colonisation and white supremacy. Resistance under the immense weight of oppression, of retaliatory theft of our lands, of censure, imprisonment, slavery, death and worse. We have not only borne the unfair burden of the polycrisis, but we continue to carry the unfair burden of the fight against it. It is time for this emerging consciousness in this still very much colonial society to genuinely engage with Indigenous conversations and actions rather than just inviting us to your table and to your spaces. It is time for colonial society to ally and share the costs of our acts of resistance against the reality underpinning everything, which is white supremacy. This cannot happen without constitutional reform in Aotearoa. All New Zealanders must engage with Mātiki Mai, Moana Jackson's legacy towards constitutional transformation. This is an opportunity to embed constitutional values that will enshrine the protection of life, be it Indigenous or that of the broader environment. There must be tangata tiriti, Pākehā spaces that explicitly focus on and do the necessary work for constitutional transformation in relation to white supremacy. The fight to honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the tikanga o Indigenous law it affirms is not just a fight for Māori rights. It is a fight to make no one, no taonga or treasured part of the environment disposable, sacrificial. The fight to honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the environmental fight of our nation, as the fight against white supremacy is in fact the fight to save humankind. Āpiti hono tātai hono te hunga mate ki te hunga mate. Āpiti hono tātai hono te hunga ora ki a tātou katoa. Tihei mauri ora.